All right.
Back on the mic.
We're on
the mic.
On the mic.
Turn on the mic. We messed
Turn
up.
it on.
But yeah. Anyway, all right. So today we're gonna go over climate and Brazil and the midterms and possibly any review from last time. Does anyone remember anything they wanted to say from last time that they didn't say?
No, not really.
Yeah,
we were critiquing political figures, and we did talk about.
Yeah, we'll have more to talk about, like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
but we'll do lots of that.
Yeah.
So.
I wanted to say one more thing about guns is that I think we need to emphasize training a lot more than we do, and like one of the statistics about accidents that just should never happen. There's no reason that accidents need to happen if you're trained well, and the idea too that one of the ideas that bugs me around guns is having guns in your house endangering your children, and how people lock up their guns and keep them away from their children. Like, that's a good idea, obviously, especially when they're really young, but I think it needs to be paired with gun safety training so that the kid, because if you have weapons in your house of any kind, eventually the kid's going to come into contact with them and they need to know how to deal with them. Honestly, I think it would be a good idea to have that in schools, where you just have, like, when you're in elementary school, they just kind of go over rudimentary gun safety in case you ever come across one, just to make sure that it gets done.
Yeah, I like that idea.
See, I bet critics would say, "Oh, well, you're going to train the shooters to be better at it."
But this would literally just be safety. It's like if you encounter a gun, like these are the safe things that you need to know.
It's not like target practice not even here's how you reload quickly.
if it stays pure safety, I think that would be okay. But I worry that wouldn't happen. I worry that would be way too easy for gun companies to be able to like work their way into schools and do stuff.
It's super easy to do. Just have the sheriff come.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it.
Yeah,
if you just have local law enforcement.
Oh, are we talking about like literally like a guy comes like once a year maybe?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just comes to school.
Yeah, it wouldn't need to be like a class that you do.
Okay.
I mean, it takes a reasonable person 10 minutes to learn gun safety.
See, I wish there was not to go off topic already, but there's so many things I wish we taught in school that had to do with just like sustainable real life skills. Like, I mean, everyone should know how to, hunt and fish and fucking grow their own crops and fix a car, and we don't learn any of that.
Honestly, I go even more basic than that, and I think we should learn how, like, coping mechanisms is a big one that I think that we just completely ignore. Like, learning.
Yeah, we don't do much emotional education.
Nothing.
Yeah.
We expect the children to get that all from their parents. And then you're putting
parents are usually pretty bad at
Exactly. You're putting people in a situation where they're bound to repeat whatever their parents have.
Yeah.
Right?
They were never taught.
Yeah. So why would it be good? Unless they went out and learned it themselves, they have no chance. Yeah. And so I think those kinds of things where it's like, if you don't get it from your parents, you're kind of fucked. We need to fix that. Like, there's no reason that we should just expect all parents to be good at that. Because clearly they're not.
No.
There's tons of adults that don't know anything about that.
Well, I think maybe we should talk about that, like, this kind of topic another time, only because I think it totally deserves its own time. But it's like, what is it that a school even symbolizes? Because I don't think people really even know that. Because, like, right now it's much focused towards like markets.
Yeah,
you're being trained for jobs, and that's literally it.
Yeah,
so we could definitely do a whole podcast on just the education system.
But that's the funny thing is, it's not even a well done school for a market if that's what it's structured for. Because that means then the companies need to almost own it, tell exactly what you need to teach these kids so that we can hire them into our fields.
Yeah.
But they don't.
Well, really,
they're trying to.
What it is, though, it's not even that. It's not even preparing kids for being good employees. It's just testing, right? You're just showing off that you can follow instructions, you can get assignments done on time.
Well, in a sense, that is making you a good employee. It's just making like easily moldable, subservient people.
All I'm saying though is it's not really for what they're going to be doing specifically.
Exactly. It's just to make them like a blank slate that'll be good, malleable Play-Doh.
Yeah, that cartoon of like the teacher going to each student, cutting like little bubble like over their head. Have you seen that?
No.
Cutting it to a square and like all the
no matter what it is,
different shapes and sizes.
That's amazing.
It gets to me every time. I'm just like,
I'm glad I was such a fucking rebel in school. I hated I hate authority. I'm such an anti-authority person.
Me too. I think one of the things that really helped me was coming into school with already knowing a good amount about some things, you know? And so then when we got to some of those subjects, I was like, wait, like, you didn't explain that. Like, I remember it. Or, like, that's a shitty representation of that. Or that actually is wrong. And I had that very early on. So I was like, wait, these people don't know shit. Yeah. These people don't know anything. These are just random people. And I know people that are smarter than them. And I've learned a lot from them already. It's like...
That happened to me, too, really early on. Primarily just with history. When I learned about ancient Greece, I was like, you don't know much at all. Like, this textbook's really simplistic.
Yeah. When I remember distinctly being in high school history class, and we were learning about World War II or something like that, and they mentioned something about the guns in World War II. And my dad was a gunsmith, and so I've learned a shit ton about guns from him. And they just glossed over something and completely fucked it up. And I was like, raising my hand, you fucked that up. Like, let me explain it better. And I explained it to the whole class, and the teacher was like, "Oh, okay, I didn't know that." And it's just such a good example of how they don't. They're flying by the seat of their pants a lot of the time.
Yeah,
they don't know.
I mean, it's hard because like a lot of times, you know, especially in public schools, a history teacher in particular is not really going to be put in charge of the time periods they've specialized in.
Yeah,
you know, teachers a lot of times are put in, you know, a classroom to teach something just because they didn't have a teacher for it, and it's not like their specialty.
Yeah. Dude, I had an English teacher for science in the 8th grade.
So yeah,
and she didn't know anything.
I'd be a horrible science teacher.
Anything, and it was really bad. She would say something in class, and then she would look at me to see if it was right. Because like sometimes she would say stuff, and I'd be like, "That's wrong. Like you got this wrong," and explain how it was wrong. And so she started like asking me sometimes if things were right, and I was just like, dude, I'm in fucking 8th grade. You're supposed to be helping me.
I mean, I guess the best way to manage that, you know, I think it's good if teachers kind of give you disclaimers. Like, look, here's my areas where I know a ton.
Yeah.
Here's the areas where, like, if you guys know things, let's have a discussion.
Totally. Yeah.
At the very least, that should happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, it'd be ideal if people knew what the fuck they were talking about.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But again, another really good example of different kinds of education is, I know in different European countries, they have like a more non-linear style where, you know, a classroom has multiple teachers and it doesn't stay on one topic. The conversation moves organically and different teachers chime in with their expertise and the conversation just kind of flows more naturally.
That sounds really
I mean, if you think about it, it's like the lowest denominator would be if no one read anything and then you had to teach what the thing was that you were supposed to have read the day before, right? Because that's like the idea of like learning is going to be you need to know some information.
Yeah.
And then the idea of being in a classroom full of people is to discuss that. Right. Otherwise, go home, look it up on the internet, read some books, you'll learn there.
Yeah.
The people are around you so that you can have a discussion. So for me, it's like one of the most important characteristics a teacher can have is someone who can really create discussion.
Definitely.
Who knows how to like conduct that, you know, in a good way.
Definitely.
Well, that's what we didn't have in school. Like, I think, like, the last year, senior year, we had, like, the economics class.
Oh, yeah,
debate and stuff.
Yeah,
but other than that, like, there was no debate. It was just a PowerPoint and
I started to really shine senior year, too, in government. With, I think it was Holman, too. Yeah, he was just a good teacher.
Yeah, he was.
I know we do this really cool exercise where he'd split the class in half. Nice. Based off of, like, he'd have a position, and you would pick what side you held that position on, and then you'd take turns going across the room to argue, and you'd watch people move from one side to the other based off the arguments that were happening.
So cool.
It was really, really neat.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and I really like that idea, too, because I think one of the problems that we have with debate in our country is that it's very much, I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Let me convince you. It's not, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's figure out what the right answer really is. And that's a much healthier way of going about it.
There's some new research in how to teach history effectively. I saw a study coming from Harvard on this new technique where what they'll do is when they teach you about something that happened historically, they'll first teach you all the context around it and then have the class argue it out and come to their own conclusions before they tell you what actually happened. And so then,
cool.
as you're learning history, you're kind of like getting that contextual opinion, and it's not just like this static thing. You're like, well, I don't agree how things went that way. And now you're seeing, well, then that connected to this and that connected to that, and it's just much more, I don't know, much better.
Yeah. Well, that's also really interesting too, because if that's properly framed, and then they decide the thing that actually happened,
Yeah.
then they get to see where that might have gone wrong.
Exactly, and then
Yeah.
what happened because of that, and then they'll rethink about their own arguments.
Totally.
So it's really
Well, it's just actually engaging to the mind versus just remembering
Yeah,
like,
it's not-
dates and
yeah.
facts
Yeah.
and
memorization is utter horseshit.
No, and it's stupid too, because especially now, we have the internet at our fingertips all the time. So knowing facts is not very useful.
Well, yeah, and most people just go, well, I don't need to. I can just look it up. If I need to know
Exactly,
it.
and they're totally
okay.
right.
I'm not gonna. Though I will the way
Not
that
that it's bad to know things.
No, and there's
but-
obviously you need to know, you need to have context for things, and
Right.
you need to have, knowledge of how thoughts have already, or just how things have worked out already to a certain degree, and it's not to say that you shouldn't know anything.
Well, no, it just
But-
makes it way more. It makes the conversation a lot more nuanced if you can say this is literally the data, and
Yeah.
then people are like, "Oh, that's the data."
Totally.
Yeah, let me not waste your time where you're trying to convince
See, but
me because I can make the deduction from there.
Data, I mean, it's going to get different between like social sciences or history and hard sciences, but
Yeah.
like it's a lot different when it's like you're being tested. Like, oh well, what year did President Monroe pass the Monroe Doctrine? It's
Yeah.
like, well, I know generally what time this happened.
Yeah, that's
and I know what it was.
Yeah.
I don't need to know the dates or when he was born or
Yeah.
when
well,
this
unless you're
happened
for some
exactly.
reason talking about like literally the year before and the year after.
Right.
But I
know?
think the point here, though, is not that we shouldn't teach any facts. It's that it should be much more organized around how to think and how to converse and argue, and ways of like styles of thinking and ways to check thoughts.
It should
and
be more
information.
substantive and conceptual as
Yes.
opposed to technical.
Exactly.
Well, here's like the cutest thing for me is like having taken like cognitive science classes. It's like
Cutest.
I think
I
it's
think you're cute, Drew.
well, I think it's cute that
Especially in that sweater. Oh my god.
I think it's cute that people worry about facts, like that professor, that our education system's even centering on facts, because I'm like, guys, you learn in context. The best way to learn something is literally like, if you want to know that the liver does a certain function, you have to be able to know why your body even needs that function to be
Right.
occurring.
Yeah.
What is it connected to? What is all of this too? But you don't it's like you will know the fact because of its function, not because you just not by going from the fact to the function.
Right.
that's why I really did not like school, or I struggled, because my brain, unless I can see where it's useful,
Yeah,
I
you just kind of
don't take it in.
We
Almost
know
everybody
that
goes-
no, that's
everybody has
the
that
brain
problem.
doesn't do the brain's not
Then
like
why don't we change the school system?
because
And-
well
Because
a
you're
lot
trying
of
to
the
make
s-
people who are capable of following directions that are important to them, because that's what our work is.
okay, that is one side of it, but the other side is a lot of the science hasn't been like super recent.
Yes,
So
that is. I think there's a lot of the power of the status quo.
It takes
in
time
that.
Yeah,
to catch up to
yeah.
the...
But it's just that's how it was, and it used to be more important that people knew things, right? Because you couldn't just look it up. You had to go to a fucking library and sift through, thousands of books or a giant ass encyclopedia just to get one little snippet of it. As opposed to now, I could type something into my computer and it'll shit out 100,000 answers to whatever I want.
Also-
so it's changed now. The information escape is
in the amount of time in which we want to function in too, because like you could also be like the first thing that came to my mind was like doing some organic chemistry reaction. It's like if you really want to do back in the day, go to a book, look at like the thing that you want to make, and then make it step by step from that. But it's like if you need to do that for the market the next day, you better know that shit and how it works so that you don't need to go to the book.
right.
You just do it right then and there, and you can get it done as quickly as possible, because some other guy might think of the same idea and patent it.
Definitely.
But
And there's also, it's important too that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because scaffolding is a huge concept that's very important. Like you have to have a certain amount of requisite information to understand more information going forward.
Yeah.
So it's not that the whole concept is broken. It's just that it's become hyper-focused on one aspect, and it completely forgets about the idea, like teaching people how to think. And I think that's a fundamentally more useful aspect too, because if you teach people how to think and how to learn and how to, converse and all these other things like that, then it's much easier for them to go out in the world and learn facts than it is if you teach them facts and then they have to learn all the other shit.
Yeah. See, I think part of it too is like this kind of like, like meritocracy gone awry, because I know one of the arguments is that, well, we need to do all this testing so that we know which schools are performing so they can be rewarded based off their performance. And it's like, well, the irony is, overall now, your performance is shit compared to other countries. Right. So you're missing it. You're missing it somewhere.
Well, I think that is they're testing the wrong things.
Yeah.
I don't like the testing, the way we test, too, like the multiple choice.
No.
It's like, just my last thing of college, I was doing, like, some of the multiple question ones, and the way they word them, they're purposely trying to trick you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, now you're just like, you're playing mind games with me instead of,
the way you structure the sentence, and then the four is just like, you're playing a game versus like, you're not actually wondering if I know this. Yeah.
And it's frustrating also because if you know that there's a test at the end of your class, then you're going to be thinking about it differently than if there wasn't, right? And so I've been in a lot of situations where the subject matter was interesting to me, but I hated it because I had to be so strict. I had to be like, oh, better write that down, better memorize that little thing, better make sure I know all this. Whereas if I had just relaxed and thought about it, I would have learned probably more, and I would have enjoyed it a lot more.
So I think we need to get rid of tests.
Well, I think they need to be restructured at least.
Some of the best education systems, like Finland and stuff, they don't even have homework.
Nice.
So, awesome. That's like so radically different than how we teach.
Yeah, I think if it was debates and more interactive during the class and not like just slideshows and remembering facts.
They've done studies that show that homework doesn't increase student performance, right? Like the things at home that increase student performance are like, especially when you're young, reading with your kids, having music, playing music in particular, and there's a number of other ones that
playtime's huge too.
Playtime's huge.
Creativity, just free creative expression.
Yeah,
that's so vital to human nature. Anyway,
way off topic.
Yeah,
no, that's okay.
That was a good topic. We could get into that more later too, but we want to start on the climate change.
Yeah. So, how many of do you guys all read that UN report?
I didn't read it.
Yes.
Well, wait.
I read parts of it, and I read articles about it. I didn't read the whole thing.
I read the article, but I didn't read the report.
Yeah.
Because it was really fucking long.
I copied one of those pictures, the picture they had of, like, this guy in China, just, like, covered in fog with the mask.
Yeah.
I sent it to my dad when he was just, like, spamming me with Trump messages.
Well,
I'm like, because he doesn't believe in it, and I'm just like, here's a picture.
I can't.
Well, Trump doesn't.
I know. You know what's ironic too is Trump. His whole focus on immigration is such a fraud to me because I think it's purely for political gain in the short term. Because all of his actions that are exacerbating climate change. You do realize there's going to be mass migrations from the global south to the north with climate change rolling in, right? Like, on one hand, you are condemning the migrations, that's happening right now. And on the other hand, you're ensuring it's going to get significantly worse in the future.
Yeah. One of the, so I listened to this awesome podcast, Waking Up with Sam Harris, number 95, with Joseph Rome, I think is how you say his name. He's a climate scientist and a reporter, like a science reporter. And one of the things that he was saying about that is that the Syrian refugee crisis was, I want to say, around 2 million.
And it's going to be nothing. It's going to be nothing.
The refugees are in the next, I think, by 2050, they're going to displace around 1 to 2 billion.
Yeah, it's going to be... It's different than...
Holy shit.
It's like a different term. What am I thinking? immigration versus migration. We're talking mass exodus of populations.
Yeah. And one of the other things that he was talking about too is that it's even worse because if we don't curtail it, we're looking at like progressive sea level rise over the course of 100 years or so. And I think if we don't stop it at under 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degree Fahrenheit rise, then we're looking at by the time I want to get this right. By the time we get to 2100, we'll have 100 feet of sea level rise per decade. Like that's the speed of rise. And so at that point, it's like, where do you stop? How far inland can you go, and how at what height do you start building your infrastructure again? Because in a decade it might be flooded again, right?
It's like that scene in Cloud Atlas where they're in like this futuristic city, and you look out the window and you can see the sunken ruins of the old metropolis in the distance. And they're like, yeah, this one's going to be underwater too in another few decades. We're building a new city. It's like...
it's exactly like that.
Well, I don't want to... So one of the ideas that comes to mind for me when I think about this situation, I think, okay, overall I want to like give the idea that we can also adapt and we can create engineering like programs that will take this into consideration. So that being said, I think one of the things that we could do most easily would be to create cities that are made to go underwater.
Very true. But
on land now.
And we got to be clear that there's two very different conversations, which is mitigation versus adaptation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
definitely.
And we should do a quick little mark here that the science, the big thing in this UN report is we have till 2030 to stop like the worst, like the cycles that we're not going to be able to reverse.
2030?
We have till 2030. We have till 2030 to get net zero carbon emissions.
Well, that's the thing. It's not just us. It's the world that has to do that, right?
Although us and China are the two biggest players for sure. And
India.
if we put all of our might into making both ourselves and the world adapt, it could happen.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that honestly, if we shifted to green energy, like just 100% shift, the economic growth would be almost the same. Like it would be like 0.1% less. That's I think the difference that Rome is saying.
Well, but that's what we know right now. Like we don't even know about the adaptation that people would have to do like based on that.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that's not a good reason not to.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean I'm just saying it's like one of those situations where you're like, oh, well, I'm worried about the projection. And it's like, no, this is literally what we know right now.
Yes.
The economy will be the same.
And it's also I think there's a fundamental problem, right? So like, if you acknowledge that climate change is real, then it's really easy to just be like, well, if we do nothing, we're looking at trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, like literally multiple trillions of dollars of wealth is going to just evaporate.
Oh yeah, not to mention, I mean, just think of the political instability. I mean, you can't even calculate.
It's crazy. So I think the biggest problem is getting people to act and getting people to acknowledge that it's real.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest problems that I see, and I think the reality one is the hardest for me to wrap my head around because people are literally just denying that it exists.
I mean, that's the first step, and I feel like they're only going to acknowledge it when it gets so bad that it's
basically
so hard not to.
Yeah. So I have a few things that I took notes on that I want to kind of just run through. So first of all, one of the myths that happens a lot is people are like, well, you can't predict the weather. Like you can't, my weather prediction on the TV is wrong, so how do you expect to predict something 50 years in advance, right? And so that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between climate and weather. So climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. And weather is on a very small scale, right? And climate's on a large scale. So year to year, the fluctuations are very, very small. Like we know that June is going to be hotter than January, right? And those are just, at least in the northern hemisphere, right?
We know the macro trends, but it's hard to predict the micro results.
Very, very hard. And so those are fundamentally different things. There's been around 0.5 degree of temperature variation since the last ice age. And now we're looking at upwards of 2 degrees Celsius change. So it's like 4 times as much. And it's happening 50 times faster than we would expect if it was natural. If there was no human activity, the Earth would actually be cooling right now. So
We were because we were still in the Holocene, and it was expected we would get another ice age.
Yeah.
And what's happening now is because we've emitted so much CO2 so rapidly since the industrialization, we're pushing the Earth into a new geological epoch, which they're calling the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
And it's going to radically change the cycles of the planet itself.
Yeah, totally. There's a website called Skeptical Science that runs through like all the major things that people deny about it, and it'll give an explanation of why it's wrong, and then it'll link to relevant scientific articles if you want to check them out. So that's really cool. There's like the leading scientists say that there's a 95 to 100% chance that humans are responsible for 100% of the warming since 1950, and there's a 97% consensus that humans are responsible for at least 95% of it.
Yeah.
So then something that I didn't know was that the water vapor in the air is actually what's causing most of the warming. It's not the CO2. So the CO2 and all the other greenhouse gases caused a slight amount of warming, which caused there to be much more water vapor in the air. And then the water vapor is actually what's trapping a lot of this heat.
It's just like a cycle, reinforcing
yeah,
cycle.
exactly. So ice is a huge thing. Ice reflects a lot of heat. And then once you melt it, not only do you have less heat being reflected, but you have more water, which turns to more water
which
vapor.
traps more
and
heat also.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
It's just a shit show.
All
All of these feedback loops are where it starts getting really scary.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't think about how consequential it's going to be when, the actual, what are they called? The...
Ice caps?
No, the ocean, the way the oceans flow.
Currents?
Ocean currents.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if those change, we have no idea the amount of change that's going to cause on the planet.
And the acidification of the ocean
Yeah.
is already a huge deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, the amount of damage. It's just
Yeah,
ridiculous
just running
to even think
running
about.
through the acidification too. If what's happening is that we're getting small changes in ocean temperature, and that allows for more carbon dioxide to be dissolved into the water, which increases the acidity of the ocean. So when carbon dioxide is dissolved in water, it turns into carbonic acid. And previously, we've had a bunch of coral that are taking all of that acid out and turning it into calcium carbonate to make reefs. But what's happened is that the acidification has gotten to the point where the coral can't handle it anymore. So they're dying, and now they're not able to take out the CO2 in the water. So it's just another
getting
one of those
worse.
feedback loops. So just for anyone that didn't necessarily understand how that works, it's pretty scary. One of the other things too that people will bring up is if our climate changes, and we can just move further north, right? So we can just move into the places that are currently ice and just move our breadbasket up there. And that's true to a certain degree, where there will be a lot of fertile land in Siberia and Canada, but we also get much less sunlight up there. So the production will be way lower than what we have now.
I heard something about how in the short term we could actually improve production of crops in the United States because there's going to be a massive increase in rainfall. So it predicates that we find an intelligent way to channel that water and use it for crops. But this is still just short-term stuff. Eventually, the negatives are going to outweigh that.
Definitely. So that's just kind of a rundown of a lot of the things that were talked about in that podcast. So that's a really great podcast if you just want to get a bunch of information about it. But I think as far as tackling the issues that I was talking about of just people denying it and people not acting, as far as denying it, I think there's two ways that we can go about trying to get through to them. And the first way, and I think the easiest way, is instead of talking about climate change, talk about pollution. Because very few people deny pollution is bad.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be retarded. And if they say, sorry, retarded.
It's fine.
If they say that they don't like it, then they can just stick their mouth over a tailpipe and see how they like that. Right?
Yeah, just look at a picture of downtown China.
Exactly. And there's clear evidence that there is like a direct link, right? We know that people's lungs they can't handle that.
It also lowers brain function. There's a new study talking about that.
And it increases risk of Alzheimer's too. So I mean, there's tons of reasons aside from just fucking the planet that we could just be like, okay, well, sure, let's just, maybe you're right. Maybe, we know you're not, but maybe you're right. What would you really want to live in a world where we're just polluting though, right? Like that's still a bad thing. So let's curtail pollution in the ways that we know how, and things will be better. if either of us is right?
Yeah, right.
So,
oh no, we made a cleaner planet.
I know, exactly. And then the other thing too is you can frame it in terms of betting rather than like saying climate change is real. It's like, okay, what would you bet that it's not? Would you bet the entire fate of the planet? And
see, that's the thing.
race?
That's the thing is like your skepticism is fine, but you have to look at the context. The context is if you're wrong and the vast majority of the scientific community is correct, we are dealing with an existential threat to civilization.
Exactly.
And that's too high of a stake for you to gamble.
Exactly. And if we're wrong and
then nothing will happen. It's just we make cleaner technology. And nothing bad happened except certain companies no longer are going to be dominant. Oh, when you weigh those things, you're just being insane.
I know. And those companies could just reinvest in other things.
Yeah.
They could
if we have
reinvest in clean energy.
We'll subsidize them being the ones that transition to clean energy technology. I don't give a fuck.
And it's also stupid because then we get off of oil and coal, which we know are going to run out eventually anyway. Yeah. Right? So, like, those
it's so funny. I've
things.
Heard people be like, argue, no, the planet's making more oil. You're full of shit.
I mean, yes, but not
at the
enough.
rate that we're, with infinite growth of civilization. Yeah, okay. All right, get out of here. Get out.
Yeah, as opposed to just harnessing the power of the fucking sun.
Yeah, right? A giant fucking fireball in the sky.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway. Yeah, just to put some more thoughts on this in terms of how it's going to affect geopolitics. So I was listening to Lawrence Wilkerson talk about this because he took part in a big, a simulation that involved foreign policy officials from a bunch of different countries and climate scientists. And they all got together to look at the data of what's expected to happen and go play by play how these different experts within foreign policy communities from different countries think their country will respond, beat by beat. And it was absolutely horrifying. I mean, by 2060, the simulation came out that all the peer powers, United States, Germany, France, Russia, all the peer powers were building armed walls on their borders. We're talking machine gun manned border walls. And that this was assuming that each of these countries tried to respond in a humanitarian way as long as was sustainable. Yeah. This isn't even assuming they responded in a xenophobic way, which they might. We're seeing that right now.
Yeah.
And it was so crazy when they were doing a presentation about it, and one of the officials from Germany was like, I absolutely don't believe that our country would respond that way. I protest. And when they cited the foreign policy officials from Germany who participated, the good dude just sat back down.
Damn.
Like, it's crazy. And they were saying the majority of the migrants are going to be young men, and that most of them will be armed.
Probably.
Because they're going to we're not talking about immigration. This is migration of displaced populations on a massive scale.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. I think for me, it's also like, that whole like economy thing, I think it would be naive to think that it would be anywhere similar to what it is now, because it's like the amount of infrastructure that we would need to be able to create in all of our states now in like the middle, like the Midwest where like no one lives, or like the upper Middle West where no one lives. It's like we could create all of those houses. We can create them with new technologies that are all sustainable, so that when migrants come, we can just ship them up there if we want and be able to live in a healthy, nice place to live. And then we won't even have to deal with all the conflict and stuff. I just don't even understand where this like terribly closed-minded or I guess just pessimistic way of thinking is, because they like it seems as though they're making so many assumptions on like how little we can do.
I see it as like just a fundamental failure to recognize that it's a problem, right? It's like they're taking the easy way out. They're finding a person that'll tell them that they don't have cancer. Like this was an analogy that Joseph Rome mentioned, where he was talking about if your child has an illness and you go find like one doctor's like, your child has an illness, they're gonna die unless we intervene, then you might go and get a second opinion. And if that guy says the same thing, then you're not going to go out and look for the one person that'll say, no, he's fine. He doesn't need to do anything. You're going to fucking listen to the goddamn doctor, right? You're not going to poll the entire medical community and find the two people that are like, no, cancer is not real. And you're going to be like, that's my doctor right there.
Yeah.
That's retarded. Like, we don't do that. We don't play that same game when it's close to us.
Well, see,
It's just people abstracting it so that they can not think about it.
This is where it becomes an existential threat to have your society seized by, a clapped out elite of, wealthy interests. I mean, I really do think that these people feel like they're going to be able to insulate themselves from the impact of this with their wealth and power. And that they're sociopathic enough to be okay with that, even though I think they're wrong.
So you think they acknowledge that it's real but don't want to act because it will hurt their short-term gains?
Yeah. And I think they think they'll be fine.
Man, I hope that's a minority. I think that it is, personally. I think the people that are choosing not to do anything about it are sticking their heads in the sand.
Yeah, I don't think
that's
they're
a lot
that
of it.
conscious.
But think about the architects of society, big business controlling policy, or, politicians who deny it. Because, think about all the Republican political figures who just actively thwart any attempt to deal with this.
Yeah.
Because they're moneyed the people that put them in power with moneyed interests don't want them to. How can you do that?
I think
they have people come before Congress who are the foremost experts on this.
Yeah.
It's not like they're living in a bubble.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they shouldn't be.
They are a bubble of power, but they have all the relevant information being presented to them.
Yeah, it's hard for me to understand how their minds are working because it's just so contrary to my own. But I think part of what might be going on is that they are just super arrogant. And they're like, I don't care what you're telling me. It's not what I think.
Well, there was that really good example of, I forget where this was posted. It was a few months ago. But there was a climate scientist who was brought before, to speak before a handful of billionaires in a private meeting. And all the questions they were asking him was about these dangerous impacts happening, about where are going to be the best places to go and hide out. They're asking about is it going to be better to go to New Zealand or Alaska? They were talking about how are we going to get our guards to keep following orders, once the shit hits the fan and stuff like that. The questions they were asking were very cognizant about this, and it was about how do we stay safe in this world. And so there's certainly a big sector of that that elite.
Well, and I think that makes it even more important that we don't rely on them to change.
Well, exactly, and we are.
Yeah.
Whether you're on the left, a lot of people on the left just think the Democratic Party's going to save them, and it's fucking bullshit.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party, all they do is they acknowledge that it exists, and they give out small little platitudes to make the masses think they're doing something. Nothing Obama did was enough. Not even close.
Yeah.
It was all
the Paris Accord
periphery.
was really good. That was a really good start.
It was a good step.
Yeah.
It needed to be the foundation.
Yeah. They needed to come back and ratchet everything down.
Yeah.
The second time.
Yeah.
So I think it's ridiculous that just a switch in a president can just totally. Oh yeah, now we're out of the agreement.
Yeah. There should definitely be some form of continuity with that, where if one president signs an agreement like that,
it's like the Iran
deal.
deal. It's just like the Iran deal, and now countries are like, well, why the fuck should we listen to what you say? Next president, you're just going to rip it up and go to war with us.
Yeah. And we're realizing now that the only thing keeping that continuity was just respect and the understanding that that's what would happen.
Right.
But now we have a maniac who's just like, fuck it, I don't care. I'll just dump out of whatever plane. Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw another article about the loss of animal life since, I think it was the 70s.
Biodiversity.
Yeah, biodiversity. I don't remember the statistic, but it was overwhelming. It's something like 70%. 70% of wildlife has been killed since not even a century ago.
Mm-hmm.
What the fuck?
Which is the importance for that is that there's obviously the kind of just empathetic or
well, yeah, there's
emotional
but also we need that biodiversity to sustain civilization.
Well, we need the biodiversity to sustain any kind of life.
Exactly.
It's more biodiversity allows for more adaptation to changes. And so if there's little, it's the same
It's like an Interstellar where it's like all that's left is corn.
Exactly. That's what I was literally going to say. The one that's terrible if there's only corn left, because one virus that is really good at killing all of that corn can kill it in like.
And that's what was happening. That's what was happening.
Exactly.
And that's not even talking about like the emotional or spiritual ramifications. I mean, what's the value of, you know, the fact that our children are going to probably grow up in a world where there's no elephants anymore, or no tigers, or no rhinos. I mean, there's something lost there that has inherent value, that these creatures... I mean, this is the only planet we know that has life on it.
Yeah.
And there's something inherently sacred about life, to me. That's my opinion, and I think a lot of human beings would feel that way as well. One
of the things that I've put forth when I talk to some of my other friends who kind of are very pessimistic about the outcomes of this climate change is that I think that one of the solutions is going to be that we create technologies that allow us to be kind of like closed off from the world while it's changing a lot, and then we continue research into terraforming our own planet.
Yeah, that's
into
such
making
a
it
dark
livable again.
outcome, though.
I think it's the most, to me, it's the most reasonable. I think that is the most like, I can't really think of anything that's more optimistic than that.
I mean, more optimistic would be, you know, a mass global movement that was like militantly oriented around civil disobedience to demand immediate and profound action.
I don't think. Okay, how about realistic?
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah,
I think it could happen. I don't think that's necessarily unrealistic. I don't think it will happen.
I don't think it's. The only reason why I don't think it's going to happen is because people won't know. I feel like one of the biggest boons to civil disobedience is actually having evidence to suggest that the
it's probably not going to happen until the effects start rolling in.
And then I think maybe you're right. And I think maybe you're right. But I don't think that's. I think the problem is going to be that we create a narrative that actually will lead to that more biodiversity in the future, bringing back all of our animals by creating a planet again that is able to sustain them.
And that's something I thought about too, is we need to be, I'm sure we already do in a lot of cases, but we need to be collecting, whatever we need from these different animals that maybe we can bring them back once we've made a world that's more habitable.
Do that.
Yeah. But I do think there is some hope, because I really do think there's going to be another mass movement that happens in the somewhat near future, with another large economic collapse, because there's more and more talk.
Better be soon.
There's more and more talk that it's going to happen around 2020. Well, all the biggest banks are saying they're expecting 2020, which lines up with a presidential election. And there's worries that it's going to be worse than 2008 because we've used all our little tricks. Interest rates are already near zero. I mean, it's bad. So and there's a lot of predictions as well that in the future we're going to see an international mass movement that's organized around anti-capitalism and climate change. That those are going to become linked because they are linked. People know they're linked. So, if that got triggered soon enough, that could really change things. But
I just don't think that the problem is we're talking about we're going to have, you said, net zero by 2030. And I think that just the technological changes that would have to occur, I think I just have a hard time thinking about that happening within 12 years.
Yeah. Well, I think there is an alternative as well, where if we get to close to net zero, and then with our clean energy, we start doing carbon sequestration and water vapors.
Well, but that's where, again, so one of the things...
Reforestation is going to be huge, too.
Well, one of the things that I saw is online... it was the two brothers on YouTube that always talk to each other, but they were Vlog Brothers. Thank you. Yeah. And he brought up a study that was recently done that showed that we have to think about the climate change in a way where it gets to a point where things are going to happen, and then you can try to adapt the come back from it by doing carbon sequestration and stuff. Mm-hmm. But the problem is you've already disturbed the system, and that system doesn't go back to normal.
Exactly. I don't think this is something people understand. Is they're saying if once we hit 2030, if we haven't gone to net zero, it's going to be a different planet.
Right.
And there's no going back to the planet we have now.
Right. But I do think that we may be able to create a planet that would be sustainable to life again, but won't be.
For sure. It's not going to be the planet we have.
Yeah.
It's never
But
again.
imagine the wars.
Oh yeah, wars over
Fought
water,
over,
and territory. There's going to be wholesale sections of this planet that become uninhabitable. They're saying the Middle East isn't going to be inhabitable anymore.
Totally.
I mean, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You're talking about an exodus of the Middle East and huge sections of Africa.
Yeah, if you don't let them in, they're going to physically.
Yeah, most of them are going to be
fight
armed.
their way in.
Most of them are going to be
because it's their life
Well,
and
do
their
you see, like-
families.
well, and the population. When you analyze the population, it is going to be mostly young people, and a lot of them are going to be armed young men.
Well, this is why it
Some of them
confuses
have
me.
nukes.
This is why it confuses me why we're not investing in that, like, premeditated, like, going and fixing up their countries, giving them technologies or giving them places
We're not
to go
even
stay.
Should
acknowledging
be.
it's
That was
real.
part of the Paris Agreement was
Was
to help countries that needed new infrastructure. Help them get
Well,
off
that was
this
part
country.
of the whole, bashing of it that Trump said. Is like, we need to stop repairing other countries. We need to stop giving money to other countries. We're getting screwed. America first. And it's like, this is a global existential problem. If you want to talk about, empire or NATO or, public relief in other, all these different things, fine. This is something else.
Also, just write laws where people, like, will give you some of their profits for a while. Make them pay you back. It's weird how short term we're thinking now. Especially when we have to be thinking so long term.
Well, this is one of my biggest criticisms of the systems we have in place, primarily which I would attribute to capitalism, since it's so focused on short-term profits. But I mean, the one thing that makes us more likely to survive in the long term than any other species is that we can think in the long term and make decisions now to adapt to things that are going to happen later.
Yeah.
And yet, because of the systems we have in place, we have negated that quality, which means we are more likely to survive than any other creature that's gone extinct before us. We have negated that one strength that makes us superior in terms of evolutionary adaptivity.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's the only one, though. We do have the ability to adapt more readily.
Well, we can adapt more rapidly once things happen.
Right.
But negating our foresight is like,
No,
oh
that's
my
a
god.
huge mistake. It's stupid. It's so stupid. And I think the biggest part about that is that we're not listening to our,
specialists.
yeah, what's the word for, like, someone that predicts the future? I can't think of it right now. The seers.
Oracles.
Prophets.
Yeah,
Our
prophets.
prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're, that's kind of a term shrouded in religion, but
It's an
you can
important
think of,
function in society.
You can think of science as a religion,
Yeah,
and our scientists are predicting the future, and they're usually pretty good at it, and we're just like, nah.
Yeah. And why? What? Money, power, temporary things that are going to go away.
All
Yeah.
short term.
I mean, yeah.
Well, it's also there's psychological issues too, because it's like,
For sure.
it's a paradigm shift. Like,
Yeah.
being able to actually change how the world works in your head is difficult unless you give people a safe environment to do so. So that's like, again,
Well,
this
and we
is
have
where,
people actively fighting against it. I mean, we know that big oil, their scientists realized climate change was happening 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And they immediately poured resources into propaganda for science denial, climate change denial, to keep people not changing it.
That's something I think should be illegal. It should be illegal, and like if you purposely misrepresent or put out fake science, so that you can influence the things that people think are real, you should be in jail, and all of your assets should be seized to fix what you've done.
Because that's what happened with the tobacco companies.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's literally the same thing.
And
with
a
oil
lot of
companies.
like the Koch brothers and the like the sugar companies that basically made it so that our food pyramid was completely wrong.
Yeah.
Like all that shit should be just completely illegal. And if a company does that, I honestly, like, this is a crazy thing if we ever actually passed it, but I think that company, all their assets should be seized by the government. They're like, anyone that was culpable in that decision should be in jail.
Yeah.
And then all of the assets should then be used to undo any of the harm that they did.
completely full scale.
Yeah. That's just like you're harming the entirety of the human race if you promote misinformation.
Well, it's so difficult because it's so integrated. I mean, the biggest single user of fossil fuels on the planet is the U.S. military, which is a global empire. I mean, it's so hard to untangle all of this.
Well, I think that if anyone who's listening and is interested in seeing like this kind of thing in a more narrative style, the Cosmos show that was put on by Neil deGrasse Tyson and the guy who put on Family Guy, Seth something.
Seth MacFarlane.
Seth MacFarlane. Yeah. So he paid for all of it. If anyone didn't, that's pretty amazing. But he literally made it so that it came back, and then asked Neil deGrasse Tyson if he would narrate it. But
it's amazing.
They go through in the United States leaded gas and why all of our gas is unleaded now. And there's a whole episode basically speaking about the scientist who did all of the research concerning that and gives an amazing narrative of what actually happened. So like he was studying a meteor to find out what was in the meteor, and he found that there was way too much lead in the meteor that didn't make any sense, and so he knew that there was something wrong with the equipment that he was using, and so he tried to clean it, but there was still way too much lead, and so it led him to getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner until he invented the clean room. This guy invented what we use as the clean room for all, like anything that we need super sanitary and without any impurities. Like that's for science, that's what we use. So then he found out that he got the right results, but he was like, okay, well, where's all this lead coming from? And he found out that it's from gas. And no one knew that like lead was getting put into the air, into our waters, all on our streets. And lead will
awful.
Kill you.
Yeah.
It will destroy
and
your brain.
It makes you less intelligent.
Exactly.
Permanently.
Yeah.
And there is no safe dosage of lead. All of the lead that you ingest in your lifetime will stay in your body until you die and make you permanently stupider.
Great.
So he recognized this and went in to write a report on it, and literally companies sent in lawyers to go and buy it off him, and he was like, no. And so they got their own counter scientists, and they had a whole court collect and decide whether or not these scientists were true or not.
Jesus.
And the only reason why we have unleaded gas now is because this guy kept saying that had better science.
Principle over profits, baby.
That's evil. That's
evil.
So
that's true.
And I'm sure I'm missing something, so I would recommend going and just watching Cosmos is amazing if you want to understand a lot of these characters, like a lot of what we're talking about right now and how the world works scientifically. Cosmos is a great introduction if you guys have no idea for it. So
yeah, that's awesome. That brings up something that I was going to say just a moment ago too, is that one of the things that I think is so detrimental about Trump is that he is spreading the idea that the truth is not important.
Yeah.
He's saying whatever the fuck he wants, lying just constantly, badly, obviously, contradicting himself in mid-sentence.
Yeah.
It's like the fact that there is no respect for the truth. It's the same problem as people making counter science, quote unquote. Like that should not exist.
Well, Hannah Arendt, who's one of the great researchers on totalitarianism and fascism, she wrote this in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is one of the prerequisites for fascism is called the permanent lie. Entering the state of the permanent lie. And so that's really scary.
We really need to send a message that you can't fuck with the truth. I think that's just a fundamentally important thing.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that like a lot of people are upset with postmodernism about.
Right.
And I actually was one of the things that I brought up with. There's a regular that comes to the coffee shop that I work at named Stuart, and he's a pretty dang smart guy. And he runs the largest vegan collective in like the Western Hemisphere. He does Veg Fest every year up in Seattle. But he and I were talking about this because he's part of the baby boomers and he's always really interested in how we're thinking. and we have a lot of like these philosophical discussions. And one of the things that I brought up with him was, I think that so many people are interested in the power struggle idea of postmodernism, where there's like these sets of powers that are just trying to get like basically war with each other, and that they all use their own narratives in order to fight each other. They get that conflated with the idea that there is no objective truth.
Right.
And so I think one of the difficulties right now is that Trump's using that to its advantage, into this idea that there is no truth. Everyone feels as though there's just people trying to obtain some sort of power over everyone.
Right.
And the one thing that is the saving grace of science is that the studies that they do are supposed to be able to be replicated and show the same conclusions.
So that's always something that's been interesting to me about postmodernism, because I believe there is truth in that, and that there very much are sectors of power that only care about furthering their power, and they'll do anything to do it. But your response to that should not be to emulate them.
Yeah.
Like,
well, it's the whole idea of that is like one of the most pure examples of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Because you are like, oh, well, everyone just runs off the facts that they want, so...
Well, but see, how do you respond to a world in which, there are, these concentrations of power that'll do anything to advance their power, and that's all they care about? On one hand, you have to say, well, we have to treat them like they are that way, and so we need to fight back.
Right.
But if you then also enter their ideology, and you only care about your power...
Exactly. Right.
And you forsake your values, then you become your enemy.
Exactly.
And that's... Yeah.
And I think the fundamental not corollary, but the thing that's true that's I can't talk right now. They both have the problem where they don't value truth.
Yeah.
They just completely deny the fundamental importance of truth. And I think that's a huge mistake, because if you don't know what's true, then you're operating on false data, and then you'll make horrible decisions without even knowing it.
Yeah.
A completely irrational person who's doing everything right with bad information is still wrong a lot of the time. I mean, they can sometimes be right just by accident, but that's all it is an accident. So unless we have the actual data, then we're not going to make the correct decisions most of the time.
Yeah, it's just, we're so far down the rabbit hole now because, the only way to react to our reality rationally now is going to massively disrupt the status quo. And therefore, those in power don't like it. So
yeah, I mean, I think the easiest
the status quo is their friend. They like it. They're powerful. That's why authoritarian structures of society are so fucking stupid. Because even if there's something that's for the good of the people, if it's for the bad of the rulers, you won't do it.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone... It's weird to me if anyone thinks of society as just benefiting a small group. I don't think anyone would think of society, that would be the goal of society, right?
They shouldn't.
It is for those in power if it's a concentration of power.
Right, they're not thinking that. They're not thinking about society, they're thinking about manipulating large groups.
Yeah. But I think that's... in my mind, that's a fundamental characteristic of capitalism, is that those who hold the power see capitalism as a vehicle to further empower them, The management class.
The idea is too, like in capitalism, that the reason why it's working is because people are making rational decisions about what they should be buying.
Yeah, but that's never been the truth,
I know. I know. But I'm just saying the problem is that I find in this situation is that they're not using the premises, they're not trying to actually enact the premises that they base everything on.
Well, yeah, it's just a justification.
But
it's just a stated ideology to get the mass of people to buy into it, in my mind.
No, I mean, I would agree. I think that's why I think it's important. Again, it just reinforces the idea of why truth is important.
Yeah.
Because you're like, okay, sure, that's a premise. Is that premise true?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can create the craziest deduction you want based on premises that are the sky is green. And that whole entire thing is now makes no sense. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't exist. So why are we listening to it?
Yeah, I've seen that being a huge problem with. There's just so much information with the internet, and there's just so much data out there. Like if on Facebook, I see it the worst. There's just you can find a news article for anything.
I know.
Well, you want to talk about we were talking about education and how to teach people how to think well.
Yeah.
This is a perfect example as to why it would be, how do you select poor media? You know, how do you say, let's not listen to that thing, let's listen to this thing? And that's where, for me, that's where my scientific tendencies bring me. It's like, well, I'm just going to go straight to the source. Like, there's a scientific study where people got together and said this. You read that study, and then you say whether or not you think it was well done, and then you use that as your basis.
Ugh. Yeah. Well, that's something that I think, when I'm thinking of like the climate change movement and how it's going to develop as things get worse, something that that gives me hope is Standing Rock and what happened at Standing Rock and the strength of that being led by the indigenous cultures and grounding it in their spirituality. And I think that could be a really powerful thing to organize around. And so, I mean, I definitely think there's hope there. I think there's hope that we could do something. I think there's hope for mass movements and that kind of civil disobedience and grounding it in what's, sacred to us and what's important to us. But people are going to have to get really fucking active. People are going to have to realize that we are running out of time. There is no more time. You cannot wait for anyone to save us. We need to make the structures of power afraid of us. That is the only way things are going to change.
Yeah, it has to be a movement by the people, because we already know the government's not going to.
They're not going to.
A party system's.
They're too captured by private wealth. They're just not going to do it unless we make them more afraid of us than they are of them.
Yeah, fear is definitely.
That's what politics is. Politics is fear.
Sure. In the power sense?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily.
That's how they
fear,
operate.
But...
The only time they respond to people is when the people make them afraid. There's that classic example in Henry Kissinger's memoirs. He writes about how Nixon actually passed a lot of progressive shit because the mass movements were so strong during that time. I mean, he passed the EPA. It was like a hardcore conservative. And there's this classic scene in Henry Kissinger's memoirs where they're in the White House and they brought buses and ringed them around the gates of the White House because there's so many protesters in the streets. And Richard Nixon is wringing his hands and he says, Henry, they're going to break through the gates and get us. And that's where we want them to be. That's when change happens. That's the only way.
I mean, yeah, especially, in a way where they're not listening already. Definitely, I agree with that.
And you deny that's where we are. Yeah. So here we are.
I think that there are some. I do think that this is like where we're gonna get. That's like into the discussion that I was like having earlier when we were talking about like. I think it's more important to make sure that you're paying attention to local powers as well and local governments as well, because I think that there are some more local governments that listen more. I don't think that this should be a tactic that you use with everything, because I think it's if you move to the place that's actually listening to like what you believe in,
right,
you can get things done there. But
we all agree that, like, with this time scale, if we're actually going to try to mitigate the worst of it, it's going to have to be global and big. And...
Right, and I think one of the best ways to do it, though, is to get something that is properly functioning to show it to everyone else that that it is properly.
But that's the thing. I don't think it's a matter of good intentions lacking good ideas. I think it's a matter of bad intentions that don't care.
Well, I think it's both, to be honest. I think there's a lot of people who are a lot more pessimistic about the outcome that could be using their intelligence and creativity to figure out a solution to the problem that just really don't. They're either not reinforced. They don't see any worth in it because they have that fatalistic kind of thing where it's like, oh, well, maybe if we do just create this wonderful, wonderful place that I live in, it's not going to save the world.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that's incorrect. I think that if you do create this wonderful place that you live in, you will save the world.
See, this is the difference between local or larger response, I think, is really important. We were talking about this before the show. Yeah, I think in terms of adaptation, so let's assume we don't fix it in the big sense.
Mm-hmm.
People need to start planning for this shit to hit the fan.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think people think about the possibility of the kind of collapse that we're talking about. I mean, we're talking like serious economic collapse combined with, climate change and all this stuff. I mean, we could see a world where people aren't coming to pick up the garbage anymore. The milk isn't showing up at the store. The water's not running.
Well, the rich are prepared. They're building
They are,
bunkers
but the
and
people
shit,
aren't. We need to be building
It's just
local
ridiculous.
institutions and community ties that create local sustainability so that if the broader society starts collapsing, communities can take care of themselves and can replace those larger institutions that fail. I mean, the average American in a world where food's not showing up at the store and, these institutions stop working all of a sudden, most people are going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest right now. Most people aren't going to be able to deal with that.
There's going to be a lot of violence.
Yeah.
When people aren't eating, they'll do
Anything.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
So you need that broader movement, and you need to ground it in local community and connection and building alternative systems. And another thing to think about in terms of mass, civil disobedience and militant activism, I mean, we need to start getting really serious, and we need to start thinking about things like, strategically, blocking major roadways and ports and like strategic things in terms of our activism to get the government to respond. And we also need to realize that when this movement gets serious, they're going to respond viciously. I mean, they're already passing laws to try and treat what happening at Standing Rock as terrorism. And when activism in the past has done things like organize like port workers to like shut down strategic harbors and stuff like that on strike, they charge them with terrorism. I mean, we have to realize the government's going to respond viciously.
I just think, I do agree with that, but I think one of the best tactics that you could use against that is, if you get the whole government, a single, state government, or even a port government, like a port city government on your side, and then that port city is we're not accepting any fossil fuels in this port.
So
and then they're who to blame then?
If people try to seize their local government first, that's a very good tactic. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a great example is this Democratic cooperative movement in Jackson, Mississippi. That's how it got started, was they elected a mayor who was an activist in terms of democratizing that community. And it was crazy. The state then started passing a bunch of laws to try and get in the way of their movements to have collective ownership of the different businesses and different amounts of land and all that kind of stuff. But so you're going to face resistance, but that's a very good tactic.
Totally. And I just think that I think that is the most beneficial to everyone. Yeah. I do agree that obviously there will be individuals who will see their power diminishing and be upset about that. Yeah. But too bad. We're looking at everyone and the greater benefit for everyone. So you have to give up your power, and we're going to work
Let's
together.
just be honest, though. They're going to fight tooth and nail. And you got to be ready for that. Yeah. And you got to look at the things, the tactics they're going to use.
Totally.
And, we have to know, too, if they classify it as terrorism, so I think it was I forget the name of it. God damn it, I got to look it up. But there was a law passed, the NDAA of the something Authorization Act. Mm-hmm. God damn it. Sorry. Anyway, it makes it so even American citizens, if they are considered to be affiliated with terrorist groups, and it's that kind of vague language, they can hold you in a black site indefinitely.
I think it was Bush.
The Non-Authorization Act. You should look that. Yeah, National Defense Authorization Act. Here it is.
Have we defined what is legally terrorism?
Well, that's the thing is they're passing laws to declare different kinds of climate activism as terrorism. Like if you interrupt oil infrastructure, there's already laws on the books that literally you can get tried for terrorism if you photograph inside animal agriculture industry in different states, ag-gag laws.
That's
So, I mean, and they've made it now that if you're associated with terrorism, they can just fucking pull you off the street and put you in a black site. So, and then as they expand what terrorism means, I mean, this is sketchy. So Chris Hedges took them to court on this, and the judge actually ruled in his favor and said this is the kind of law that could be used to justify, like what we did in World War II with Japanese internment camps. Mm. And then the Obama administration immediately appealed it, took it to a higher court, and because they couldn't argue it straight up, what they did is they found a way to throw out the case based off some previous case that Chris Hedges was in. They said, oh, Chris Hedges didn't have standing in this case, so he doesn't have standing in this case either. It was some stupid bullshit like that.
Wow.
And he said the only reason they fought it that quickly is because they're already using it.
That's terrifying. The term domestic terrorism means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state. They appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. This is from
pretty vague.
lawcornell.edu.
It was like general, then got more specific towards the end.
Yeah, they wanted it to sound good at the end, but in the beginning, it
any law that, what was it? Any law that violates like federal or state
involve acts dangerous to human life that are in violation of the criminal laws of the United States. Or
coerce the population. Like, you could use that with anything. Like, so, like, if people do civil disobedience and block major roadways, so they're, like, disrupting daily life to call attention to something, they'll call that terrorism. You know, they could have used that, like, that definition. If you go back to, like, you know, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, they could have used it then. They're saying, you're disrupting society to try and intimidate people into making change. You're a terrorist.
But harmful to people.
The National Defense Authorization Act from Wikipedia is the name for each of a series of United States federal laws specifying the annual budget and expenditures of the U.S. Department of Defense. The first NDAA was passed in 1961. The U.S. Congress oversees the yada yada yada. So, what about that? Were you?
There's a specific section of it. You're probably seeing it right there with controversial NDAA legislation. When we take a break, I can look up the specific section and we can come back to it.
Okay.
What was I going to say? Anyway. Oh, yeah. So, during the case, the lawyers for the suit went to Nancy Pelosi. And this is the time when Democrats controlled everything. And they went to Nancy Pelosi and they said, we'll drop the suit. Because the law was up for to be re-voted on, to be passed again. And they said, we'll drop the suit. All you have to do is insert a clause that says this does not apply to American citizens. And the Democrats refused. So that's great.
Very great.
Anyway. So just talking about ways in which they're going to respond. It's going to be business.
I think that we're going to have to... I do think that applies to
Section
federal...
1021, maybe? Anyway.
That applies to federal government at large, but I do think that you're going to see less resistance in certain places.
Yes. Especially if it's happening... I mean, while we shouldn't underestimate how strongly they're going to respond, we also shouldn't overestimate their strength. I mean, if this is something that's happening in different places all over the country, if it's part of a mass national movement as opposed to something isolated like, you know, Standing Rock.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to be much more difficult for them to deal with it, especially if it has the backing of regular people.
Totally. And that's why, just to me, I think I would rather individuals move towards cities where they would be functioning at greater capacity, rather than resisting in places that they wouldn't get anything done. It seems as though that the resistance, not that I would say that, I mean, the resistance I think could lead to good things as well, but you have to be really organized in it. I just think that there are places that you could get a greater sense of community and get more done that could help eventually, like an investment, help the whole nation. by showing an entire, like, the whole Pacific
Certainly,
Northwest.
it'll be good to build positive alternative institutions in places that are more conducive to that.
Mhm.
But I think the resistance needs to be as widespread as possible at
Totally.
the same time.
Totally.
So you're right. It's 1021B. So Hedges versus Obama is from Wikipedia. It was a lawsuit filed in January 2012 against the Obama administration and members of the U.S. Congress by a group including including Chris Hedges. The legislation permitted the U.S. government to indefinitely detain people who are part of or substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces engaged in hostilities against the United States. The plaintiffs contended that Section 1021B2 of the law allows for detention of citizens and permanent residents taken into custody in the U.S. on suspicion of providing substantial support to groups engaged in hostilities against the U.S., such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, respectively.
Engaged in hostilities. Like,
Yeah.
look how vague this gets.
Respectively, that the NDAA arms the U.S. military with the ability to imprison indefinitely journalists, activists, and human rights workers based on vague allegations. That does sound pretty fucking sketchy.
Indefinitely.
Yeah, no right to a trial. I mean, that is the repeal of habeas corpus.
Yeah.
That's... I mean, that...
That doesn't make any sense that got passed and upheld.
Those alternative institutions you're talking about setting up and stuff too, I feel like international support by similar institutions would probably be a really necessary
Yeah,
thing.
that's actually a huge potentiality that
So
we
I
also
don't
need to
we
think
can
about.
Fight the government, you know what I mean? I don't know if people can fight that battle alone.
Well, that's another thing we need to talk about is the linking of movements across borders. Like, we need to be linking mass movements in other countries together to provide international solidarity. I mean, that's the only way we're going to deal with these issues.
Well, and I think
and this is a global issue.
You say
So the possibility of international mass movements is going to come up.
Exactly, but I guess I see it, the international thing, obviously, yes.
Yeah.
But I also think that it can be national solidarity, too.
For sure.
I think that, and I guess...
It'd be a great start.
And that's what I mean, I'm more worried about that. I think the international thing is if we get enough national solidarity on it somewhere in the United States, at least they can start saying, well, at least part of the United States figured their shit out. Because right now, all over the world, they're like, the United States does not have their shit together. Period.
Has more credibility for international support and stuff like that too.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's a great point. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I do think forming international ties as quickly as possible is really important, especially as we're seeing a sort of like international like fascist movement developing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're seeing, authoritarian right-wing movements start to link up. I mean, we're about to start talking about Brazil. So Steve Bannon, who was, Trump's main advisor for a long time, he went to Brazil to give campaigning advice to a literal fact. I mean, this dude, Bolsonaro, has said he's okay with killing 30,000 people in Brazil if they have to. Like, this is a straight... He said he wants a dictatorship, to go back to the dictatorship.
Wow.
I mean, this is a straight-up fascist.
He wants to rid the country of communists, and he's attacking the media, trying to get the media outlets closed.
I was just going to ask, like, what are his, like, stances and stuff?
Oh, boy.
Sometimes they're okay for a while, sometimes.
A democratically elected fascist is like one of the most ironic things.
But
ever,
it wasn't...
you know?
Yeah, we'll get into it.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, they...
Let's get into it now.
All right, let's get into it. Okay, so I've been following this for a couple of years, actually, the developments in Brazil. The best reporting on it has been done by The Intercept. They have one of their headquarters is in Brazil. And Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept lives in Brazil, so that's why they're so focused on it. So essentially, Brazil's democracy is only about 33 years old. They had a hardcore U.S.-backed dictatorship before that, coming out of the Cold War. And so they formed a democracy. They had a really popular left-wing president, Lula, I think his name, Lula. And he's essentially a Bernie Sanders type, so New Deal style progressive policies. Yeah.
Why would we be so invested in backing a dictatorship there? It's like a lot of resources there, like they're like Amazon or something.
So
like
during the Cold War, we backed. Yeah, that's a big part of it, and we'll get to that part of it as well. One of the things Bolsonaro's talked about is opening up the Amazon to massive corporate investment and development, which has been said, especially with the recent climate report, to be absolutely disastrous.
Yeah, that's one of our lungs. That's one of the world's lungs.
Lula.
We can live off of
Lula da Silva,
right? Or is it only
from 2003 to
Oh, is
2011?
So
I forgot that you can only
Lula da
donate
Silva,
a lung, right?
Lula da Silva had really high approval ratings. He was very popular.
Mm-hmm.
The woman who became president after him,
Dilma Rousseff.
Rousseff, yeah. So she was pretty popular too. She actually was tortured during the dictatorship.
Wow.
That was one of like her big things she was known for. So she compromised with the business forces that had been. So it was essentially business forces were dominant during the dictatorship. It was the dictator plus business forces. So she made a compromise with business forces. And her vice president was like their person, Michael Tamir. So during her presidency, they managed to impeach her on what's considered trumped up corruption charges, especially given that Michael Tamir got outed as being involved in like absolutely massive corruption scandals, and there was no blowback at all for that.
And he was president after her.
Yeah, so they imprisoned, they got her out, they impeached her. He became president. One of the most unpopular leaders they've ever had in their country. And then this recent election's coming up. And so Lula da Silva runs again because he's still really popular. And he was like, that's a coup. Yeah. So I'm going to get back in power. So he's running again. He's at the head of the polls. And they throw him in jail. Again on trumped up corruption charges. And in jail, they don't allow him to speak from jail. So he can't be involved in the election. And now once he's in jail, his successor has no name recognition. He's got to start climbing up in the polls. And then all of the business community, which owns all the mainstream press in the country, backs Bolsonaro because he says he's going to give them a bunch of gifts to big business. And he is an outright fascist. I mean, he was talking in Congress to a congresswoman, and she was like accusing him of supporting rape. And he said, I wouldn't rape you because you don't deserve it.
Oh, my Lord.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. He said we should either expel or kill all the former slaves because they're not good genetic material.
Oh my God.
He said the way you deal with gay people is you just beat them real hard if your son starts acting a little gay and they'll change their behavior. I mean, this is a fucked up dude.
Jesus.
I mean,
no.
That's all I was
Yeah.
That's all I wanted.
So, in response to him getting elected, John Bolton, who's the main security advisor for Donald Trump, said, we're happy to see like-minded leaders arising in the South.
Jesus.
He's working closely with Donald Trump, who congratulated him on his victory because he's going to let American big business into the Amazon. He's starting to call out the media as fake news. And so he's using the language Donald Trump uses, but for far more extremist reasons. And 2 days after his election, forces from his government went into schools all across the country and were pulling material on the dictatorship and on fascism out of schools.
What the shit?
I mean, this is crazy. This is some crazy shit.
That's just... How is that not, like... Is that blown up? I don't know. I mean, I've seen a couple...
It blows up if you're paying fuck attention, but not in mainstream media. You know what's crazy, too? When it happened...
That's blowing up!
When it happened,
Yeah.
business press, so like Financial Times and places like that, all they posted was stock markets in Brazil go through the roof after Bolsonaro victory. So they're hailing it as like a positive business development.
God. And no one knows anything about him.
Very little. You'd be lucky to find an average American who knows what's happening in Brazil. I promise. Bolsonaro. That's really ironic, too, because during the election, someone stabbed him in the chest with a knife, trying to assassinate him because they were so afraid of him, and they fucked it up. He survived, and his polls went through the roof after it.
Of course.
It humanized him.
Yeah.
And then he used it as an excuse not to participate in any debates going forward.
Jesus.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah, so...
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know, like,
it's just depressing.
what to say other than yikes.
Yeah.
And I would be very interested to see how people would react to hearing that. Like, if it was widespread, what the polls would be like. I would just be interested if people actually would give a shit. I don't know.
Well, let's just
I don't
also
know.
articulate. I mean, this demonstrates that big business would prefer an outright fascist to a social democrat.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the numbers go up,
Yeah.
right? That's literally what it's
So,
like.
I mean, everything we're talking about with climate change, I mean, these people have no moral compass. It's just money. It's just money and power. So we should not be
That
surprised
is
about
their
climate
moral
change.
compass.
We should not be surprised about their actions with climate change any more than we should be surprised
They,
by their actions in Brazil.
they still want more rich, powerful people in control into the future, though, right?
But they only think in the short term.
They don't
Right, but
know
they,
what
but
that
they
means.
must. They must want to preserve a hierarchy of power somehow. There's got to be some. There's got to be something
They
to that
don't
idea.
know how longevity works on planet Earth.
All of them. I mean,
I saw-
They
Some of them
are
do.
willing to cut down the Amazon
I mean,
rainforest.
some of the powerful families are also smart too. I mean, it's not
Well,
like they're all mindless,
For sure.
businessmen.
For sure. But
You
the
know?
irony is the most long-term calculated action that one of those people could make if they're looking to sustain their power into the future would be New Deal policies. Because that would make it sustainable. It'd make it stable. It'd make it less likely to be overthrown by your population. You have to give them enough to make it so it's not going to cause this instability. That's the thing, is there's the system's incentives and the psychological nature of these clapped out ruling elites that just perpetuate themselves is that they eventually just fucking don't give a shit.
But I mean, don't we? But because of their disconnection with like most people, like
Yeah.
those types of people that they're giving those things to, I mean, I feel like that also blinds them to those ability to like utilize those resources better than they expected they could too. You know, so I mean, as far as like getting them to overdo it in a sense,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, kind of thing.
It's the difference between like just raw venal self-interest versus enlightened self-interest.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about, you brought up the idea of it, like, them being intelligent. I have no problem saying that these people are intelligent, but that doesn't mean that they know how the world works, because they're not listening to the people who study how the world works.
Well, also say that some of them might also be wise enough to try to preserve.
I don't think they're wise.
There's
Some
got to be some.
There's
of them,
certainly some.
that are also
Are we
very
talking-
powerful too. I'm just saying,
yeah,
like,
yeah. I mean, if we're gonna go and
Yeah.
we're gonna talk about what, Bill Gates, and we're gonna talk about
I don't
like
know.
There
I
are
don't know.
Well, there was
Elon
actually
Musk.
a recent article in The Guardian that analyzed the political activity of billionaires in the United States.
Mhm.
And it showed that people like Bill Gates, like liberal billionaires, was like a super small amount
Exactly,
of them.
that's
And
what I
the
was gonna
vast
bring up.
majority were like just like trying to repeal Social Security, just like raw like conservatism to the max.
which we look at that and we say, is that wise? And we say no. And
Well, no.
then
Well,
I mean-
Social Security is a shit show, so
Well,
I
true,
don't know
but
if
the
that's the best
reasons
example,
there's
but-
literally that's fair. But like, I mean, like they just
I was thinking
don't.
social policies in general.
Yeah, all of their policies are trying to repeal anything that supports the general population. I mean, after the New Deal, there was a whole ideological section of the business community that made it their entire mission to repeal anything done during the New Deal. Because they saw it as an intrusion on their dominance over society.
Totally.
And I think that is the ideological roots of the ruling class we have today.
Totally. Which again, when we look at what the New Deal did for the country, we
Yeah.
see that
Well, it's just raw class
better
warfare.
things.
They want to be the masters. It's raw class warfare.
Which I don't think is wise.
Chomsky says it really funny is they are Marxists, they're the original Marxists. They have reversed values from Marx. Marx just noticed them and created a backlash among the population that was a mirror image of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same idea as of when we look at the psychology of advertising and stuff like that, and how that could have been used to be able to let people know that advertising fucks with your head, and instead big business was like, oh, that's how it works? I'm going to use that to now just to be able to control people better.
Yeah. This is kind of a scary thing. In one of the podcasts I was listening to, I think Sam Harris had a social psychologist on. I can't remember his name. It might have been Jeffrey Miller. I can't remember. Anyway, he was talking about how one of the things that's really upsetting is that in social psychology, it's really hard to get funding for a lot of different kinds of studies. And the best social psychologists are probably at Facebook. And just they have so much data about what's going on that they can just do incredible studies that then they're not publishing. They're only using to further their own interests.
Yeah, and I think the thing that bums me out most about that is, if we look at, we can look at just archetypical structures of how society is supposed to work, and you look at the wise person, and you can look at, if we're even contemplating whether or not these individuals are wise, or if they're just purely intelligent and powerful. It's we look at wisdom, the moment a shaman says something that makes everyone pissed at them, he's dead. They kill him, and then they replace him with another shaman. Now, we can't do that kind of stuff. If you're intelligent and you're trying to manipulate people and people see through you, it's well, I have to convince everyone else now, and I have to figure out some constructive way of dealing with it rather than being able to just call them out and do something about it.
Yeah. There is an inherent lack of wisdom in the action of trying to manipulate a bunch of people when you are few kind of thing, But at the same time, when Dan mentioned that you have to be prepared for them to fight tooth and nail, you also have to be prepared in the fact that they are just as wise and as intelligent as you, because that's another aspect that you can't underestimate.
Well, it depends on what we're talking.
Well, I'm saying if you're gonna treat them as a powerful enemy, you literally have to assume that they are at least as wise and intelligent as you.
Dude, I'm not going. No,
You know what I mean?
I think you're conflating the things that we're talking about. One is a power struggle. They're way more wise than me in power struggle. They've been doing it this whole time.
Right.
But
I don't know
idea
shit.
Is that itself wise?
Exactly.
Right.
It's a meta wisdom.
It's also the difference between tactics and strategy.
Exactly.
I mean, are you thinking, way into the future, or are you thinking I'm going to win the next battle?
Right, and that's what they're good at. I would be.
Yeah.
No,
Ferocious tacticians. Ferocious tacticians.
But if their goal
in the north,
if their goal at all is longevity, it's going to be that they're going to be too flying by the seat of their pants that they're going to end up in a hole somewhere because the Earth's destroyed. And they could be living, but that's not wise living.
Just don't think you're too better of a strategist than them as well. You know what I'm saying?
I don't think there was any of that in there.
The only thing that we're dealing with here is that they're not admitting to the fact that we're destroying the Earth.
Well, not publicly.
No, by destroying... No, or
I wonder
if they are, they don't
them.
care. If they are, they don't care.
Yeah.
They're destroying... if they're willing to destroy the Amazon rainforest, they don't care.
Yeah.
Well, this was slipped into... it was 50 pages into a report the Trump administration put out. But I forget which report it is. But it was essentially saying, well, we're not... They were admitting climate change, figures in the Trump administration who put this out. They were like, well, it's not going to be fixed, so we might as well just keep developing things as much as we can. So that we come out on top.
Can we ever call ignorance wisdom? Because that's what they're doing.
I'm just saying, if there are some that want to preserve the power, they must also, be accepting of what problems will prevent them from preserving it, which climate change, a world-ending, or a drastically world-changing thing, that being, it's again, it's the things where they are building these preparations where You know what I mean? Where it's completely, counterintuitive for what they say.
I really bet some of them think that they're going to come out on top after climate change. Because they think...
What does that mean, like, after?
No, but check this out. I think some of them think there's going to be a mass culling or die-off of the population.
For sure.
And that they're going to be able to just have artificial intelligence and build a new world on the graves of the human race.
See, I mean, those are fundamentally different mentalities, right? So we have people that might be denying that it's even happening.
Might work, though.
We can't have two conversations at once. So
Sorry.
It'll fuck everything up. So there are people that are denying that it'll happen, and then there are people that are admitting that it is going to happen and then have different opinions about what to do, right?
Yeah.
So the people that are denying it are just being stupid. They're just wrong, right? And we know that. The people that are admitting that it's real but have different opinions about what to do, that's a different
that's true.
I think it needs a fundamentally different answer.
Definitely.
Because deciding that it's gonna happen, so you may as well rape the earth while it's rapeable, like, that's not wrong in terms of the science, right? But it could be...
It's not factually wrong, but it's wrong in every other human sense of the word.
And it's a horrible answer because obviously it's going to make things worse, and that's not good.
See, I'm honestly at the point where I think our answers are like collapse or revolution. And as I've said in multiple times before, I believe in nonviolent revolution. We can get into that if we want to, but I believe we need to overthrow the current power structures.
What about massive shrink?
Massive shrink? What do you mean by that?
Like not necessarily not being mutually exclusive from either of those options you presented, but like as in just people not necessarily a violent conflict or like some kind of thing through like how governing operates now or something like that, but just ways like just smaller communities, like more states essentially, but like smaller more states, and then with more. Area.
Like a breakup of the United States?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, just like having more states and going about it like that route.
How does that solve anything? What are you talking? Like, what are you saying that would do?
Are you saying that would be a way of overthrowing the centralized power structure?
Yeah, just like.
So if we want to talk about
like dispersing
like
it more?
different forms of revolution, because I think that would be a revolution, in
right?
a sense.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay.
So sure,
great, sure. Different forms of revolution.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
And
I think
I'm like, don't like revolt in like the traditional like cliche kind of sense.
No.
We've talked about that.
My idea of revolution is
that
like
just won't work.
mass militant civil disobedience to shut down the necessary infrastructure of the system to either force power to be overthrown or to respond in drastic ways to your demands.
Right. Yeah.
Isn't that the same definition of what a terrorist is?
Yeah, and apparently that'll get you in a black site for indefinitely. So.
Good luck.
Well, I just also, again, I think that there's the alternative option that I put forth with trying to go through like local governance,
Right.
And trying to actually
like I was saying, I think simultaneously we need to be building local institutions to weather what's coming.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you like devalue and hamstring like economic and financial like systems? Because that's what you would need to like do.
Yeah, no, it's actually a lot easier than people think. The people who research and study revolutions say you only need 3% of a population, but they have to be committed to going to jail, losing their everything. They have to be willing to make their life be activism and to totally put themselves on the line. And what that would mean in a tactical sense is things like, blocking major roadways that are important for commerce, blocking major harbors, surrounding political institutions. I mean, physically halting the process. And so what's 3% of the population? We have 350 million. Mm-hmm. What would be 3% of that?
No, it's going to be like 11.
That would be...
No, 10.5.
10.5? So that's what we're aiming at. If we wanted
10.5 million people?
Yeah. Woo! But that's much more easy to imagine once consequences of climate change start kicking in.
True. And
a serious economic collapse.
We already established that 8% of the population are progressives, so that's already quite a bit more than you would need. They just have to be progressive enough.
and principled and seized on the correct issues and have an alternative. Here's another thing. If we're going to have a revolution, you sure as fuck better have a clearly articulated alternative that you want to build. You can't just try to break what's there. Because something that happens constantly in history is once there's a revolution, there's a counter-revolution where different authoritarian forces seize control in the vacuum. You have to know exactly what you're trying to build in replace of what you're overthrowing.
The burden of proof, dude. You can't just criticize a freaking argument or how things are going without coming up with a better solution for it.
Yeah, the burden of proof is a fucking perfect, concept for that, because, if you think about it, too, if it's massive civil disobedience, a pessimistic kind of, approach to it, or passive approach to it, sorry, but, that means you're going to get hit with a stick if you're doing it that way, right? So another strategic, I think, element to that would be making the stick softer when it hits you. And that means, what's their stick? The cops, right? You know what I mean? All the enforcement, the judges, everyone in the law department, essentially. It's you target those people, and then you get the hierarchical psychology leached out of them, and you rehumanize them in a certain way. I think that's a keystone element as far as the strategic thing, because they're going to be the ones arresting people and forcing people to do things. Yeah. The human, because it's still a human job right now.
Another key element in successful revolutions is to get certain sectors of the power structure to turn sides. Mm-hmm. Whether that's, the police.
The stick people.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
the weapon people.
The police are often used, by the power structure to enforce against the powerless. But, they're working class people. They're members of our community.
But if cops understand the decisions being made will make it so that their kids will have a harder life, or their grandchildren are going to have a harder life. Their son they've bred to be a cop.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, right? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So it's that kind of just that being the panacea to that essentially. So
yeah, and that's why it's so important to have a movement based off of working class solidarity among all of the people, and something that's not about partisan divisions or tribalism, but about bringing everyone together and, trying to make a better world for all of us. We need to be looking at people like MLK, people who fought in that kind of way that was about bringing people together no matter, what their divisions or what their classifications. And if we keep getting sucked into these tribal divisions, we're doomed.
Yeah, the adamantine rod that is their stick needs to be a little piece of styrofoam when it hits us. I think that's really important.
Well,
if you're going to do the proper passive way, because you're going to get hit if you do it the passive way. Well, and you need to be able to take the hit. You know what I'm saying?
I don't necessarily think. I do think it depends. I don't think that you have to get hit at all. I really don't. I think there's a way to not get hit.
I'm saying the tooth and nail scenario. Not necessarily getting hit physically, but that too, Well,
we should also know
less of the hitters, whatever that means.
There's protection in publicity, and there's protection in, how broad is your movement. If you're getting, local, families to come out and protest with you, they're not going to respond in the same way. You need to realize Occupy Wall Street, for example, terrified them. Because you had people, walking through those places with strollers with their, kids. It was friendly to the general population. And that kind of thing, where it's inclusive to the sectors of the population that you cannot publicly, damage and get away with it. You need to have that. So, Noam Chomsky has a famous quote: there are only two superpowers left in the world, the United States of America and global public opinion. And I think that's especially, we need to think of the internet and that kind of thing as our main strength.
Wait, what in the public opinion?
The United States of America and global public opinion.
So the opinion of the United States.
No, the opinion of the math people.
Right. I was just combining those into the same thing.
Anyway. Well, I've had some wine, so I'm a little tipsy, just for the record. All right, well, we are celebrating a birthday in the group right now, so we're going to go ahead and close out the podcast. And on our next episode, we will get into the midterms. Sorry we didn't get into that tonight, but we're going to enjoy some festivities.
Steady up.
Yeah.
So thank you
We're
for
past
listening.
those
Stay in
midterms.
school.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
We love you.
And don't forget.
Don't generalize, okay?
We do. He does too. Dwight does.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, he does. He
Don't
just pretends he
forget-
doesn't.
Turn on
He'll
the
save
mic.
your life.
Turn
Turn
on
on
that
mic.
mic.